The midday sun hovered above the Carson livestock arena like a watchful eye, baking the earth into a hard, cracking crust. A faint wind stirred the dust, carrying the scent of horses, sweat, and distant cattle. Wooden bleachers groaned under the weight of worn-out denim and sun-creased faces, men who'd seen more than their share of rodeos and regrets. This was their world, a place where pride spoke louder than words. In the center stood Warren Decker, 63, richer than most, louder than all. His gold belt buckle gleamed against his deep blue denim, and his presence pulled attention like a storm rolling over the plains. The next horse to enter the ring was unlike the others, taller, prouder. His chestnut coat shimmered like old copper, and every muscle tensed as he stepped forward. The handlers struggled to contain him, but Rust, as he was known, moved with a silent resistance, his eyes burning with something beyond fear. Memory, maybe. The crowd shifted. Clyde Monroe, leaning against the rail, narrowed his eyes. "That ain't a regular horse," he muttered to himself. Warren raised his hand, and the handlers stepped back. A hush fell. The stallion stood alone in the arena now, nostrils flared, ears twitching. Warren took a step forward and flicked the whip in the air, not to hit, just to show who was boss. Rust's ears pinned back. He reared slightly, his front hooves hitting the ground with a warning thud. The crowd gasped. But Warren chuckled. "You'll learn who's in charge," he said, smirking. But the horse didn't flinch. He didn't move. He watched Warren with an intensity that unsettled even Boone Trammell and Jet Calhoun, who stood near the gate. "Look at his eyes," Jet whispered. "Like he's sizing him up." Warren lifted the whip again, a little higher this time. That was when Rust lunged, not wild, not panicked. He moved with precision, a single powerful shove that knocked Warren off balance and flat onto the dirt. The crowd let out a ripple of shock. Dust clouded the scene as Warren scrambled up, face red with anger and embarrassment. "He needs to be taught a lesson," he barked, brushing himself off. But Rust stood tall, proud, completely calm. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't even angry. He was in control. Roscoe Dillard smirked from the fence. "Looks like someone else's running the show." None of them knew it yet, but Rust had a story, a history, one that tied directly to Warren's darkest memory. And as the past clawed its way back to the surface, everything in that dusty arena was about to change. The arena had mostly emptied, but the tension lingered in the dust like a storm that hadn't fully passed. Warren Decker stood alone near the loading gates, fists clenched at his sides. His pride stung more than his bruised hip. The laughter he'd heard after Rust knocked him down wasn't loud, but it echoed in his head like gunshots. Warren didn't care much for animals beyond what they were worth, but there was something in that horse's eyes that rattled him. Not fear, not wildness, recognition. And that made his skin crawl. Clyde Monroe approached slowly, the brim of his old hat shadowing his tired eyes. "You all right?" he asked, voice low, as if wary of waking something sleeping between them. Warren didn't answer right away. He looked back at Rust, who stood quietly in the holding pen, untouched by the chaos he'd caused. "He's not broken," Warren muttered. Clyde nodded. "No, but maybe he ain't the one who's supposed to be." The words hung heavy. Warren glanced at him sharply, but Clyde just tipped his hat and walked off, leaving only the sound of boots on gravel behind. Later that evening, under the orange wash of sunset, Silas Weatherby, Warren's oldest ranch hand, backed the trailer up to the edge of the pen. Warren insisted on buying Rust despite everything, outbidding the others by thousands, just to prove a point. But even Silas, who'd followed Warren's orders for 40 years, shifted uncomfortably as they loaded the horse. "He don't move like the others," Silas murmured. "Feels like he's thinking." Warren scowled. "He's just another damn animal. Nothing more." But Warren couldn't sleep that night. Back at the ranch, he tossed in his bed, haunted by flashes of a time he didn't talk about anymore. A barn. A fire. A man shouting his name. And a younger version of himself turning his back on it all. He sat up in the darkness, sweaty, heart pounding. Somewhere out in the stables, Rust neighed, long and sharp, as if calling to something Warren had buried deep inside. Meanwhile, across town, in a quiet house with fading paint and shutters hanging crooked, Loretta Gaines sat at her kitchen table with a worn photograph in her hand. The image showed a younger Warren, standing beside a horse that looked exactly like Rust. Only that couldn't be right. That horse had died years ago, hadn't he? Loretta traced the edge of the photo with a trembling finger. Her eyes filled with something between fear and purpose. "You came back," she whispered. "God help us, you came back." The following morning broke cold and gray, a strange contrast to the dry Texas heat of the day before. Warren stood outside the main barn, coffee in hand, eyes fixed on the paddock where Rust now roamed freely. The stallion hadn't caused trouble overnight. He didn't buck, kick, or charge. He simply watched. Every time Warren stepped near the fence, Rust turned his head slowly, locking eyes with him. Quietly, like he knew something Warren didn't want remembered. Warren tried to shake it off. "It's just a damn horse," he muttered, but the words rang hollow in his throat. Inside the barn, Silas Weatherby brushed down the other horses, glancing toward Rust every few minutes. The old ranch hand had seen a lot in his years, but never a horse quite like this one. There was stillness in Rust, but not passivity. It was the calm of someone waiting. Silas pulled off his gloves, walked outside, and joined Warren at the fence. "He's settlin' in strange," he said. "Like he ain't tryin' to escape, but like he's waitin' on something." Warren didn't look away from Rust. "Maybe he's just smart." Silas paused, then added quietly, "Or maybe he's rememberin'." Across town, Loretta Gaines stepped into her attic for the first time in years. Dust clung to the beams and sunlight cut through the small window in thin golden lines. She knelt beside a wooden chest and opened it with shaking hands. Inside, faded notebooks, horse ribbons, and one leather-bound journal, Abner's. Her late husband had spent years breeding horses, recording bloodlines, behaviors, training methods. But near the back pages, she found a note in different handwriting. "Rust, colt from Shadow. Fast learner. Eyes like he understands. Temper unpredictable. Warren says not to train him my way. Says I'm making him too soft." Loretta pressed her lips together. That was the year everything fell apart. Back at the ranch, Clyde Monroe arrived uninvited. He parked his old truck beside the barn and leaned against the post, arms folded. "Mind if I have a word?" he asked Warren. Warren didn't bother hiding his irritation. "You got something to say, Clyde, say it." Clyde nodded toward the paddock. "That horse ain't just familiar. He's blood." Warren froze. For a second, the wind seemed to stop. "You don't know what you're talking about," Warren said coldly. Clyde didn't blink. "You sure? 'Cause he's looking at you like he does." That night, Warren walked into the stables alone. The other horses stirred when he passed, but not Rust. The stallion stood still as stone. Warren leaned on the stall door and whispered, "Who the hell are you?" Rust didn't move. But in the silence that followed, Warren felt it, something old, crawling its way back into his bones. The next day, the wind carried a strange stillness across the ranch, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Warren stayed away from the paddock all morning, but his thoughts circled it like a buzzard. The image of Rust's eyes haunted him, something ancient in their depth, as if the horse carried a memory that didn't belong to animals. Warren poured himself a drink before noon, something he hadn't done in years. He stood at the window of his study, watching Rust graze alone. "I buried that part of my life," he whispered. "It should have stayed buried." In town, Loretta sat across from Hollis McReynolds, the local veterinarian and one of the few people she still trusted. She slid a photo across the table. Rust at the auction. Hollis leaned in, squinting. "He's the spitting image of Shadow," he muttered. "That was Abner's best horse." Loretta nodded. "He had a colt right before." She stopped. "Before the fire. Before the betrayal." "You think it's him?" she asked. Hollis frowned. "I think it's impossible. But yes. I also think Warren knows more than he's letting on." Back at the ranch, Silas took it upon himself to clean Rust's stall. As he worked, he noticed something odd, a small scar, just under the stallion's left shoulder. A jagged mark shaped like a crescent. Silas stepped back, brow furrowed. He remembered that mark. Years ago, on a foal that Abner Gaines was training, the one he was so proud of. The one Warren said had been sold. Silas rubbed his beard, troubled. "You ain't just any horse," he muttered. "You're a ghost with a heartbeat." That evening, Warren rode the perimeter of his property, hoping the rhythm of the land would quiet his mind. But every fence post, every tree, seemed to whisper fragments of a past he couldn't drown with bourbon or bravado. He thought of Abner, of the deal they made, of the choice Warren made when money and pride stood above loyalty. He stopped his horse near the northern ridge, where Abner's old barn used to stand, now just ashes and wild grass. "I told myself it was just business," Warren said to no one. "But it never felt like that." Meanwhile, Clyde Monroe drove to Loretta's house. He brought no pleasantries, just questions. "You kept anything from back then?" he asked. Loretta nodded, leading him to the attic. Together, they laid out old journals, maps, breeding records, pieces of a puzzle long forgotten. "Warren thinks the past is dead," Clyde said. Loretta looked down at Rust's photo. "Then why is it staring him in the face?" That night, Rust stood silently in the moonlight, facing the ranch house. Inside, Warren stared back through the glass, each man carrying secrets neither one could voice yet. Warren woke before dawn, his shirt clinging to his chest, soaked in sweat. The dream had come again. Flames licking the sky, a horse screaming, Abner's voice calling his name, but fading as Warren turned away. He sat on the edge of the bed, breathing hard, gripping the mattress like it might anchor him to the present. The past was no longer just knocking. It was inside the house, pacing the halls, whispering through the cracks. And outside, in the paddock, the stallion stood in the fog like a sentry guarding old sins. Down at the barn, Silas waited for Warren, holding a folded piece of paper he'd found tucked in an old saddlebag marked with Abner's initials. It was a faded receipt, proof of transfer. But the signature at the bottom wasn't Abner's. It was Warren's. Silas didn't ask questions. He just handed it over and said, "You want to tell me why you signed off on sellin' a horse Abner swore he'd never part with?" Warren stared at the paper like it was a loaded gun. "I thought no one kept this," he said quietly. Silas's silence was his answer. At that same moment, Loretta was pulling onto the dirt road that led to the Decker Ranch. She hadn't been out there in nearly 20 years. Not since the night the barn burned and Abner came home with soot on his face and betrayal in his eyes. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tight. In the passenger seat beside her, the old photo of Abner and Shadow fluttered under the breeze from the cracked window. It wasn't just about the horse anymore. It was about closure. About justice. About truth that had been silenced for too long. Warren stood by Rust's paddock as Loretta's truck appeared through the dust. Their eyes met before she even stepped out. There was no yelling, no immediate accusations. Just a silence so thick it felt like the earth had stopped turning. "You know who he is, don't you?" she said. Warren didn't answer. But Rust took a slow step forward, as if drawn by her voice. Loretta's eyes welled with tears. "He's Shadow's son. He's all that's left. Clyde arrived moments later, carrying the breeding records they'd pieced together. This horse, he was never sold. He was taken, Clyde said. And the man who did it buried more than a bloodline. He buried a friendship. A life. Warren turned away, jaw clenched, heart pounding. Rust stepped closer to the fence, eyes locked on the man who had rewritten his past. Inside him, Warren felt something crack. Not guilt. Not yet. But recognition. Of the moment everything changed, and the lie that cost more than he was ever willing to admit. The barn was quiet except for the distant creak of wood in the wind and the soft shifting of hooves in the stalls. Warren stood in the shadows, staring at the old receipt Silas had handed him earlier. His name was there in black ink, clear as day. It was a document that once gave him power, now a piece of paper that accused him louder than any man ever could. Outside, Rust stood still at the fence, ears perked, as if listening for something beneath the silence. Loretta stepped forward, slower this time, the years pressing on her shoulders. "He wasn't just a horse, Warren," she said softly. "He was part of Abner. Part of what kept him going after you turned your back on him." Her voice didn't tremble. It was steady. Tired, but strong. "And when you took that colt, you didn't just steal an animal. You stole what little trust he had left in people." Warren looked at her then, really looked, and saw the years he'd ignored written in the lines of her face. Clyde held the journal in his hands like a sacred text. "This ain't about business. Not anymore," he said. "That fire, that argument. I remember you two fightin' behind the barn before the flames started. No one ever proved nothin'. But it wasn't hard to guess." Warren clenched his jaw, but his eyes gave him away. Regret lived there now, raw and unhidden. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. "I never lit the match," he said. "But I let the barn burn. I walked away. And I let everyone believe what they needed to." Rust let out a low snort and pawed at the dirt, restless. Loretta stepped closer to him, placing her hand gently on the rail. The stallion moved to her without hesitation. It was the first time anyone besides the handlers had touched him without resistance. She pressed her forehead to his, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You knew," she whispered. "Even after all these years, you remembered." Warren looked away, his chest tight with something he hadn't felt in decades. Not shame. Not guilt. It was grief. The realization of what he'd lost. Not land, not money, but the man he used to be. A man who once rode beside Abner, who once believed in loyalty, who once saw horses as something more than assets. He didn't know how to get back to that man. He wasn't even sure if he could. But as Rust stood beside Loretta in the fading light, Warren felt the weight shift inside him. The truth had finally stepped into the open. And though it had cost him everything, he could no longer pretend it hadn't happened. The ranch felt different the next morning. The air was cooler, the wind slower, like even the land itself had heard what had been spoken the night before. Warren didn't sleep. He sat in his study until dawn, a bottle of bourbon untouched on the desk beside him. He kept looking at the photo tucked inside Abner's old journal, 3 young men standing beside a newly built barn, proud and smiling. Abner, Clyde, and himself. Before money. Before betrayal. Back when friendship meant something he still believed in. In the barn, Silas was quiet as he fed the horses. When Warren entered, the old ranch hand just nodded, saying nothing. There was no need. They both knew a line had been crossed years ago, and finally, someone had the nerve to speak it aloud. Warren moved toward Rust's stall slowly, cautiously. The stallion stood still, watching him. Warren didn't try to touch him this time. He just stood on the other side of the gate and said, "I took you from a man who loved you. From a life that should have been yours. I don't expect forgiveness." His voice cracked. "But I needed to say it." At Loretta's house, Clyde sat at her kitchen table, sipping black coffee from a chipped mug. "He looked like a different man yesterday," he said. Loretta nodded, eyes fixed on the window. "Maybe he is," she replied. "Or maybe the guilt finally wore him down." She glanced at the envelope sitting on the counter. Inside, copies of the breeding records, the journal pages, the old receipt. Evidence of what was taken. "What are we supposed to do now?" she asked. Clyde leaned back in his chair. "That depends. You want revenge or peace?" Warren spent most of the afternoon in the stables, not speaking much, just working. Cleaning stalls. Fixing hinges. The kind of labor he hadn't done in decades. Silas watched him with silent approval. Every now and then, Warren would pause to glance at Rust. The horse remained calm, as if sensing the shift. Trust didn't come easy in this place, but maybe it didn't need to come all at once. As dusk settled, Loretta arrived at the ranch. She didn't ask permission. She walked straight to Rust's paddock, and Warren met her there. They stood side by side in silence. "I'm not here for apologies," she said. "I'm here because he deserves better." Warren nodded. So did Abner. In the fading light, something unspoken passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a shared understanding that what was broken might not be fixed, but it didn't have to stay broken forever. The next morning, the air was heavy with the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Warren stood in the doorway of the barn, watching the sky turn a darker shade of gray. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, hands calloused from work he'd once considered beneath him. Every movement, every breath, carried the weight of years. But something had shifted. The man who once measured his worth by land and cattle was beginning to understand that some debts weren't paid in money. He walked to Rust's paddock, slow and deliberate, and opened the gate, not in a show of dominance, but invitation. The stallion didn't bolt. He stepped forward, ears relaxed, eyes steady. Warren held out his hand, palm open. Rust sniffed it, then nudged his fingers lightly. That small moment felt larger than any deal Warren had ever signed. "I can't undo what I did," he whispered. "But maybe I can do right by you now." Behind him, Silas watched from a distance, arms crossed, quietly nodding to himself. Back in town, Loretta sat across from Sheriff Glenn Bailey, a man she'd known most of her life. She handed him the envelope. "It's all there. Records. Signatures. Proof he took what didn't belong to him." Glenn examined the documents carefully. "This could bring charges. At least civil ones." Loretta took a long breath. "I don't want to bury him. I just want the truth to be known. Not for me. For Abner. For that horse." Glenn nodded. "Truth's like rain. Might not come when you want it, but it'll wash what needs cleanin'." Later that day, Warren walked the fence line with Clyde, something they hadn't done in decades. The silence between them wasn't hostile now. It was reflective. "You ever think it'd come to this?" Warren asked. Clyde chuckled softly. "You mean you admittin' you were wrong?" "Hell no." Warren smiled faintly. "I spent years thinkin' pride would keep me whole. But it just kept me hollow." Clyde stopped and looked him square in the eye. "You got time left to fill the empty. Startin' with that horse." That evening, Warren held a small gathering at the ranch, just a few old hands, Loretta, Clyde, and Silas. No speeches, no drama, just a simple announcement: Rust isn't mine. He never was. From today forward, he belongs where he should have always been. He handed the reins to Loretta, who took them with trembling hands. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. Warren nodded. "No, thank you. For not letting me forget who I used to be." As the sun sank behind the hills, The quiet around them wasn't grief anymore. It was healing, slow, imperfect, but finally beginning. The days that followed were quieter on the Decker ranch. For the first time in years, Warren moved without the armor of authority. He fed the horses himself. He cleaned the stalls without being asked. And though the ranch hands noticed the change, no one said a word. They didn't need to. A man shedding his pride didn't require applause, only space to keep going. Silas stayed close, watching like an old watchdog who had finally seen the master lower his guard. "Took you long enough," he muttered one morning, tossing Warren a wrench. Warren smirked and got back to work. Loretta began coming by the ranch regularly, not out of obligation, but care. She rode Rust in the mornings, slow, steady laps around the corral. There was something sacred in the way she touched the reins, as if each turn around the fence mended another torn thread in her heart. The stallion, once so wild, moved with grace under her hand. He didn't need to be tamed. He needed to be seen, and now, finally, he was. "He remembers everything," she told Warren one afternoon. "But he chose not to hold it against you." Warren looked at her, voice low. "I wish I could say the same about myself." In town, whispers turned into quiet conversations. People who once admired Warren for his success now regarded him with something new, respect born not from power, but humility. Sheriff Bailey never filed charges. Loretta never pressed him. The truth had come to light, and that was enough. "What matters now," Clyde told Warren over coffee on the porch, "is what you do with the years you've got left. You can't change what you were, but you sure as hell can change what comes next." One morning, Warren stood alone near the paddock where Rust grazed. He watched the stallion for a long time before unlatching the gate. Rust turned toward him, ears alert. Warren stepped back, opened the corral door wide, and simply waited. No rope, no force, just choice. Rust hesitated, then slowly walked out into the open field beyond the ranch. He didn't run, but he didn't stay. He stopped at the crest of the hill, looked back once, and then disappeared over the ridge. Warren stood there long after he was gone, hands in his pockets, a storm of emotions swirling behind his eyes. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. But something inside him finally exhaled. Letting go hadn't been about losing. It had been about making space for what might still grow. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a man haunted by the past. He felt like a man ready to face tomorrow. Weeks passed. The grass grew greener after the late summer rains, and the land around the Decker ranch began to feel alive again. Fences were repaired. Fields replanted. But more than that, something in the people had shifted, like the weight of an old silence had finally lifted. Warren walked the property every morning, not to inspect, but to appreciate. For the first time in decades, he saw the ranch not as a kingdom, but as a gift. And in every breeze, he half expected to hear hoofbeats, Rust's presence lingering like a blessing that never quite left. Loretta visited often, sometimes with fresh bread or cuttings from her garden. She never talked about the fire again, or Abner, or the years that Warren had stolen from them. Instead, they spoke of the land, of the horses, of things that still could be. One afternoon, she brought a small wooden box. Inside was a faded photograph, Abner, Shadow, and the colt that had grown into Rust. She placed it on a shelf in Warren's barn. "He should be remembered," she said. Warren nodded. "He is." Clyde retired from ranch work not long after. But before he left, he gathered the hands and gave a short speech. "Men don't get to choose how they're remembered," he said. "But they do get to choose how they finish." Then he tipped his hat toward Warren. "And I reckon this one's finishing stronger than most." Warren didn't respond with words, just a nod, eyes misted, jaw tight. One crisp morning, Warren saddled a new horse, a young mare named Willow. She was spirited but responsive, a far cry from Rust's silent intensity. As he rode out beyond the property lines, he stopped at the top of the same hill where Rust had disappeared. From that vantage point, he could see everything: the fences, the barn, the home he'd built and almost lost. The wind blew softly, and for a moment he closed his eyes. He didn't pray. He didn't speak. He just listened. Behind him, hoofbeats echoed faintly. He turned, half expecting to see Rust standing there. But it was Loretta, riding calmly beside him. "Thought I'd find you up here," she said. Warren smiled. "It's a good place to remember." She looked out at the fields. "And a better place to begin again." They sat in silence, two old souls stitched together by pain, forgiveness, and the quiet hope that even broken things can still bloom. Below them, the ranch lived on, not as a monument to a man's pride, but as proof that sometimes the hardest thing to do is the only thing that sets you free.